When he was in the army, his fellow soldiers focused a lot on, say, the accumulation of wealth or fame, which was much to his bemusement. Given that the modern world is so focused on the two things, say, wealth and fame, what would Socrates' advice be for us when fighting, say, materialism and the hedonic treadmill?
What would he advise about the pursuit of wealth and fame? If Socrates was alive today, he would think, we're probably more obsessed with wealth and fame than the typical ancient Athenian was. I think the main thing that would strike Socrates, actually, if you wanted to hear a load of BS and subject yourself to brainwashing in ancient Athens, you had to leave the house. So you'd have to walk across town to the Pnyx, where the assembly met, and there you'd hear politicians giving speeches, right? Or you go to one of the gymnasia outside the city walls of Athens, which people frequently used to hang out in, and maybe you'd hear a sophist declaiming there, right? And that had a big impact on Athenian society. But, if you're doing your gardening or whatever, or pottering about in your stonemason's workshop, you're not really subjected to rhetoric, propaganda, and political oratory that much. But Socrates, I think, would, if he could see modern society, he'd think, wow, you guys have invited the politicians into your houses, and the sophists you carry around in your pocket everywhere you go, because you're connected to the internet and your mobile phones and radio, the transistor radio was bad enough, right? Invited politicians into our kitchen, but then television and the internet. You guys are now subjecting yourself to propaganda 24/7. Everywhere you go, it's in your house you've got multiple devices beaming rhetoric, advertising, political propaganda into your brains. So he would think we're exposing ourselves far more than people in the ancient world ever did to rhetoric. And he'd see that as one of the main reasons that we're all brainwashed into pursuing values that no one in their right mind actually really believes in when they're lying in their deathbed. No one in their deathbed sits there and thinks, man, I wish I'd just earned a bit more money before I croak. No one in their deathbed thinks, gosh, if only I wish I'd been a bit more famous during the course of my life. If I could turn back the clock, that's what I would prioritize. I think most people are, maybe with some exceptions, right? But the majority of people are smart enough when they're given the opportunity to really reflect on their life, to realize that wealth and fame are kind of pseudo goals. They don't really constitute true flourishing or happiness. And people pursue them beyond a certain level anyway, because they're brainwashed through celebrity culture and consumerism and stuff like that, into believing that these things are all important. I think it's because we can't mind read. One puzzling question is, why is it that throughout the whole of human history we've made virtually zero progress, since the time of Socrates, in terms of actually getting ourselves out of this mess, and countering this basic error that we all make generation after generation? We all fall into the same trap that people in the ancient world fell into. How come we're not out of it? People keep challenging it. Socrates challenged it, very dramatically. Great religious leaders and philosophers throughout the ages challenge it, but we all ignore them and just go straight back to the consumerism and celebrity culture over and over again. Why is that? Is it something innate? Is it how our brains are wired? I think it's because we can't mind read. I think it's when you're born. Do you remember when you were born and you're toddling around?
I actually don't remember when I was born.
Do you remember when everything was made of wood before the internet? So you're in a little baby and you're toddling. I've got a baby at the moment. And you can't use language. You can't really question anything. You're looking around, kind of trying to get some sort of sense of what you're meant to be doing. So you just copy stuff, right? Babies do monkey see, monkey do. They just emulate. what they see adults doing, basically, you know. And what do you see adults doing? You see them pursuing wealth and status all around you as you're growing up as a kid, right? So, of course, you're going to think maybe that's what life is all about. It's what everyone else seems to be doing. They're going on and on about it all the time. So it's no surprise in that regard. But then if you sat down and you asked them, they'd be like, well, I'm just trying to look after my family. But, ultimately, I mean, these things are superficial, right? But that's not what you see on the outside. On the outside, all you see is people spending all the time, all day long, every day, trying to pursue, like, when they're not at the grind, like, trying to make a few bucks, they're on the internet trying to impress people, like, or shooting their mouths off about things, like, trying to sound intelligent, So we spend our whole lives kind of revolving around things like wealth, status, trying to impress other people, trying to acquire things. And if you ask most people, they'd admit that that's not really what life is about. But that's what kids see generation after generation. And that's what they start to emulate. And by the time they've acquired language and self-awareness, they start to question it, it's kind of too late. They're already committed to pursuing all of these goals. It's kind of become ingrained and habitual. I think that's why generation after generation, we need to look back to guys like Socrates that radically questioned it. Socrates, I mean, I'll relate the argument. One of the most important arguments, I think, that's in Plato's dialogues, because it's very simple. Socrates asks a young guy called Euthydemus, actually, that's one of his friends, what constitutes flourishing, basically. He says, what constitutes good fortune? And the guy that he's talking to says, well, that's easy. People usually think Socrates begins with a stupid question that's like a no-brainer, right? A lot of people thought Socrates was an idiot and they would say, you ask these stupid questions about, like, sheep and carpenters and things like that, like, you're just a weird old dude. And often the dialogues begin like that. So Socrates will say, well, what constitutes good fortune? And this guy's like, well, having a lot of money, a big house, like being born into a noble family that's got a lot of status, having lots of friends and powerful play, stuff like that, right? And Socrates says, what about like wisdom and virtue and stuff like that? And his friends, well, those are important as well, right? And Socrates says, well, that kind of makes sense. Those are the things that people pursue. But hang on a minute. What if you took a big pile of money and you gave it to somebody who's wise and virtuous? I guess they would use it to do wise and virtuous things. But if you took that big pile of money and gave it to somebody who was foolish and vicious, wouldn't they just use it to do foolish and vicious things? If you gave that big pile of money to a vicious dictator, like, would he use it to commit genocide or torture his political opponents or something like that? And, surely then money is only as good or bad as the use that you make of it. It gives you control. It's more like an opportunity or an external or practical advantage. But it's not intrinsically good or bad.